Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Murmurs, where dreams melt into shadows and stories float through your sleep. Videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying tonight's tale, The Silence in Room 9. Let's begin. It began on a night so quiet that even the air seemed afraid to move, as if the stillness itself was listening, watching, waiting for something to begin in the hallways of the old Langston Inn, a place forgotten by time and remembered only in the faded photographs tucked away in dusty boxes and the quiet mutterings of the locals who refused to speak its name after dark, where room numbers had faded and the wallpaper peeled like old skin, and somewhere near the end of the second floor hallway that bent at an angle that felt subtly wrong to the eye, there stood a door with a tarnished brass plate that read simply, Room 9. No one at the front desk ever mentioned it, and the reservation books never listed it. Yet on some nights when the fog rolled heavy off the hills and wrapped itself around the town like a memory trying to forget, someone would find themselves guided to it, not by intention, but by a strange misstep, a hallway that shouldn't connect the way it does, or a key that doesn't match any door but turns with a soft, reluctant click when slipped into the lock of Room 9. And that was exactly how Eli found himself standing in front of that door, confused, tired, and unaware that the silence on the other side was not the kind born of peace, but the kind that came when something waited just beyond the veil of ordinary sound. He had arrived at Langston Inn well past midnight, his phone dead, the rental car sputtering its last breath just as he pulled into the gravel lot, greeted only by the dim golden glow of a porch light swaying gently in the wind, and a woman at the desk who barely looked up when he stepped inside, her voice like sandpaper wrapped in velvet when she handed him a key without a room number, saying only, "It'll be waiting," and offering no explanation as she returned to a book whose pages were blank and whose cover bore a symbol he wouldn't remember until much later. Long after it was too late, the key was heavy and cold, with no tag, and yet as he wandered the hallways, dragging his bag behind him, each numbered room felt wrong, their doors slightly askew, their knobs rusted in ways that made the skin on the back of his neck prickle, until, turning a corner that hadn't been there moments before, he came upon the door with the plate, Room 9, and a feeling in his chest like he was standing on the edge of something bottomless. Eli had never believed in ghosts or omens, but something about the way the doorknob felt in his palm, not cold, not warm, but pulsing faintly, like it remembered being touched before, made him pause, made him almost turn around, but the silence behind him was louder than the quiet ahead. And something in it called his name, not aloud, not exactly, but in the way that dreams do when they pretend to be memories. And so he stepped inside, unaware that the moment the door closed behind him, the hallway that had brought him there vanished completely, like breath on glass. The room was ordinary at first glance. A bed with crisp white sheets, an old wooden dresser, a mirror slightly tilted above a small desk, and a single window covered by heavy curtains that didn't quite touch the floor. But the silence was too deep, not natural, not empty, but full, like the room was holding its breath, waiting to exhale once he fell asleep. Eli set his bag down gently, as if afraid to disturb something, and moved toward the bed, noticing as he passed the mirror that the reflection lagged by half a second, like it was thinking about what it had seen before showing it to him. And the longer he looked at it, the more he felt like the version of him inside the glass was someone who had been here before. He turned away quickly, drawing the curtains shut, though no light came from behind them, and sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing the back of his neck where a cold ache had begun to bloom, the kind that felt like fingers just barely brushing skin. And when he finally lay down, exhaustion settling into his bones, the silence pressed against him like a weightless blanket made of shadow and static. His eyes closed slowly, his breathing softened, and in that stillness, somewhere between waking and dreaming, the room finally exhaled, a long, low whisper like old wood shifting, or breath moving through a wall too thin to hide it. And Eli slept, unaware that in room 9, dreams were not separate from the walls that held them. The dream began the way most do, with fragments of sound and memory stitched together by something that didn't care for time or truth. And Eli found himself walking through a hallway, much like the one he had entered earlier, except the walls pulsed faintly like breathing lungs, and the lights overhead flickered in rhythm with a heartbeat he could not feel but somehow recognized as his own, echoing beneath the skin of the building itself. The carpet beneath his feet was soft, too soft, like damp moss or forgotten fabric left in the dark too long, and his footsteps made no sound, as if he wasn't really there, or as if the hallway refused to acknowledge his presence. And in the distance ahead, or behind, he couldn't tell, a soft humming echoed, low and slow, like a lullaby sung underwater, just out of reach. He walked toward it, not because he wanted to, but because the hallway left him no choice, curving slowly, impossibly, folding in on itself like a spiral staircase without steps. And with each turn, he passed doors that bore no numbers, only subtle indentations in the wood that resembled eyes, not painted or carved, but formed in the grain like the wood itself had once seen too much and had never forgotten. He tried to look away, but one door, slightly ajar, drew his gaze, and as he passed it, he saw just beyond the crack of its frame the edge of a rocking chair, gently swaying though no one sat in it, and a soft creak that seemed to whisper his name in the rhythm of its motion, so quiet that he almost believed he had imagined it, until the whisper paused, and whispered it again, slower this time. Eli backed away without realizing it, his breath catching in his throat, and when he turned around, the hallway had changed again. The lights above now swung slightly, though there was no wind, and the wallpaper was covered in writing that moved like ants, shifting between words he almost recognized. Words like, remember and return, and why did you come back? He closed his eyes for just a second, willing himself awake, but when he opened them, he was no longer in the hallway. He was back in room 9, lying on the bed, breathless and sweating, though the room was cold as stone, and the air felt thicker, as if someone had exhaled grief into every corner of the space, and then sealed it shut. The mirror across from the bed had fogged slightly, though he hadn't moved, and in the center of it, as if written by an invisible fingertip, were the words, "You've been here before." He sat up too fast, dizzy, his heart thudding in a strange, uneven rhythm, and the silence in the room had changed. It was no longer empty, but pregnant with something unsaid, as if the walls themselves were listening now, closer, breathing in sync with his panic. And when he reached for his phone, he realized it wasn't on the nightstand anymore. In its place was an old photograph, worn at the edges, of a man who looked just like him. Same eyes, same build, but wearing clothes from another era, standing in front of the Langston Inn, smiling as if he belonged there, as if he had never left. Eli stared at the photo for a long time, his fingers trembling as he turned it over, and written on the back in faded ink were the words, "Room 9 always remembers." He dropped it quickly, heart racing now, and stood, backing away from the nightstand, eyes darting to the window. But the curtains had parted slightly, just enough for him to see his reflection again in the glass. Not the mirror this time, and the version of him staring back had no expression, no motion, just cold, hollow eyes that didn't blink. The air grew colder then, not gradually, but like someone had flipped a switch and drained the warmth from the room, and somewhere beneath the floorboards a sound began. Soft at first, like fingertips tapping wood in a slow, deliberate pattern, not random but repeating, like a code. Eli dropped to one knee, pressing his ear to the floor without thinking, and the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until he heard, not in the air, but in his bones, the whisper of a child's voice saying over and over, "He's awake again. He's awake again. He's awake again." He staggered back, hitting the bed frame, the photograph fluttering to the floor once more, and for the briefest moment, the lights dimmed, not flickered, but faded, like the room itself blinked. And in that blink, he saw the shadow of something tall and thin standing in the corner by the door, motionless, as if it had always been there. But when the lights returned, the corner was empty, and the silence was deafening again, louder than any sound, heavier than fear, and filled with the knowledge that he was not alone, and never had been, not in room 9. Eli didn't sleep again that night, not because he refused to, but because sleep refused him, pulling just out of reach every time his eyes closed, like a dream that didn't want to be found. And so he sat on the edge of the bed, fingers laced, breath shallow, staring at the mirror that now stayed clear, no matter how cold the room became, as if something behind it wanted to be seen. The photograph remained where it had fallen, edges curled slightly, and though he had tried to ignore it, he couldn't help but glance at it again and again. Not because he wanted to, but because it called to him with a kind of familiarity that settles deep in your ribs, whispering, "You know me, even when you don't." At some point, as dawn never came, and the light outside remained fixed in that strange midnight haze, Eli reached for the desk drawer, more out of instinct than intent, and found tucked neatly beside the inn's guest directory a folded piece of paper that wasn't there before, yellowed at the edges, brittle like it had waited too long to be opened. He unfolded it slowly, breath held without meaning to, and in careful, faded script read the words, "Room 9 is a wound that remembers how it was made. It doesn't forget, it doesn't forgive, and it doesn't sleep." Beneath that line, scrawled in more frantic handwriting, was something else. "Don't let it know you're listening." He stared at the note for a long time, his own heartbeat rising like a drum roll before a revelation, and just as he was about to put the paper down, he heard it again. The soft tapping beneath the floorboards, faster now, sharper, like fingernails desperate to be let in or out. Eli stood quickly, backing toward the wall, eyes darting to the corners of the room that seemed to darken with his fear, and the mirror, always the mirror, began to fog again. But this time not from condensation, not from breath or warmth, but from something within the glass itself, like it was alive, exhaling against the barrier that held it in. This time when the fog cleared, there was no reflection, only a hallway he did not recognize, stretching deep into a place that should not exist, lit by flickering bulbs that swung, though there was no wind. And in the center of that hallway stood the figure again, tall, thin, unmoving, its head slightly tilted, as if it was listening. Eli reached forward, not touching the glass, but hovering near it, his fingers tingling with the cold it radiated. And the figure in the mirror took one step forward, not fast, but deliberate. And the mirror cracked, a thin line slicing diagonally from corner to corner, like a warning whispered through glass. He stumbled back, heart now racing wildly, and suddenly the lights overhead blinked once, twice, then held steady, but dimmer than before, as if the power was not fading, but being taken, drained by something that fed on flickering fear. He rushed to the door, gripping the handle with shaking hands, and twisted, but it didn't move, not stuck, not locked, just unwilling, as though the room had changed its mind and decided to keep him a little longer, maybe forever. Outside the door, he heard the low whisper of movement. Not voices, but breathing, slow and collective, as if something, or someone's, waited in the hallway beyond, waiting not for him to open the door, but for him to knock. He stepped back again, his mind racing to understand what was happening, and behind him, the mirror cracked a second time, a jagged cross now forming across the surface, distorting the hallway beyond. And for a single, terrible second, he saw himself standing there in that impossible corridor, eyes hollow, mouth slightly open, as if he were dreaming his own presence from the other side. The room groaned, not from the walls or the furniture, but from the very air, like the inn itself was waking up, stretching in ways a building should not stretch. And with that sound came another, the soft, unmistakable creak of the rocking chair from the hallway dream, now inside the room with him, though he had not seen it before. It sat in the corner now, gently moving, back and forth, the same rhythm, the same breathless whisper riding its motion. He's here, he's here, he's here. Eli's knees weakened, but he stayed standing, somehow, because something deep inside him, something older than memory, told him that sitting down would mean surrender. And in room 9, surrender was never silent. He turned toward the window, hoping for light, for morning, for any sign that the world beyond still existed. But the curtains now hung heavy, unmoving, and behind them was no glass, no outside, only more wall, as if the room had swallowed the view whole. There was a knock then, not at the door, but from within the mirror. Once, then twice, then silence. Eli didn't move, couldn't breathe, and the knocking came again, this time slower, louder, as if made not with a hand, but with a fist of something heavier than flesh. He stepped closer, heart thudding in uneven beats, and watched as a shadow spread behind the glass, not shaped like him, not shaped like anything that should stand upright, and yet it stood, watching, listening, remembering. The crack in the mirror widened, a hairline fracture now stretching like a smile, and from behind it, that same whispering voice returned, soft but sharper now. You left me here. Eli opened his mouth to speak, to say he didn't know what that meant, but no sound came out, only the faint exhale of someone else's breath, cold against his cheek. The breath on Eli's cheek vanished the moment he turned his head, but the cold remained, like fingers resting on skin long after the hand had been removed. And the silence that followed wasn't empty, but waiting, heavy, aware, and too still, as if the very air was holding its breath to see what he would do next. And when he looked again at the mirror, the reflection had returned, but it was no longer his. It was a version of him, yes. Same frame, same tousled hair, same scar on the chin. But the eyes were wrong, too dark, too wide, and filled with something he couldn't name but felt deep in his bones, like regret that didn't belong to him, like guilt inherited from someone else's choices. He stepped back, and so did the reflection, perfectly synchronized, and yet not quite, as if it waited for him to move first, watching closely, mimicking with intention, not instinct. Eli whispered, "Who are you?" And the reflection mouthed the words with him, but added one more, silent and clear. Still, he didn't know what that meant, not yet. But the mirror cracked again, this time with a sharp sound like a whisper breaking its own throat. And from behind the cracks, something pulsed, faintly glowing, like the light of memory trying to escape a body that wasn't ready to remember. The air grew colder again, but now it wasn't just cold. It was damp, heavy with the scent of earth after rain, and beneath his feet, the carpet darkened in patches, slow and circular, as if soaked from below, as if something was seeping upward rather than dripping down. And then came the sound. Drip, 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 not from the ceiling but from the walls. He turned to look, and there, just beside the dresser, the wallpaper had begun to peel, curling like old leaves, revealing not drywall or paint, but something darker beneath, something pulsing gently like a heartbeat behind plaster. He stepped forward, hand trembling as he reached out, and as his fingers brushed the exposed space, a sudden image filled his mind. Not a memory, not his own, but vivid all the same. A child, eyes wide in terror, standing in a room identical to this one, whispering, "Don't answer when it calls you by name." Eli staggered back, breath shallow, eyes darting around the room that now seemed to tilt slightly to the left, like the floor had shifted under the weight of a secret too long kept. And from somewhere, nowhere, the rocking chair creaked once more. Back and forth, back and forth. But it wasn't empty. There was something in it now. Not a figure, not quite, but a shape made of shadow and smoke, sitting calmly, as if it had always been there. As if this was its room and Eli was the one intruding. Its form swayed with the chair, no face, no arms, just an impression of presence, like a coat draped over a memory. And though it made no sound, Eli felt its attention sharpen like a cold knife resting against his thoughts. He backed toward the door again, willing it to open this time. And as his hand found the knob, it turned easily, too easily, and the door creaked open with a sound like an old sigh. But what waited beyond was not the hallway. It was the mirror corridor, the one he had seen in the reflection, long, narrow, lit by flickering overhead bulbs, wallpaper peeling in vertical strips, the smell of dust and time pressing in from all sides. And at the far end, just barely visible, the figure waited, still, always still. He should have turned back, closed the door, screamed, anything. But instead, Eli stepped forward, as if drawn by invisible strings woven from fear and need. And the moment his foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him with the finality of a coffin lid. The corridor stretched longer now, deeper than it should be, and his footsteps echoed far too loudly, as if the walls were listening, recording each sound like a signature on a contract he didn't remember signing. He walked slowly, heart pounding like distant thunder, eyes darting to the sides where doors stood slightly ajar, each one marked not with numbers, but names. Not his, but familiar all the same. Names that triggered fragments of dreams he couldn't recall upon waking. He paused at one. Amelia. The name pulsed faintly, as if painted in candlelight, and from behind the door came a sound he couldn't ignore. Soft humming, tuneless, childlike, but slowed down, like a record playing underwater. He reached for the doorknob, but before he touched it, the humming stopped, and the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the room was identical to his. Same bed, same mirror, same flickering light. But there, on the bed, sat a little girl with dark eyes and tangled hair, staring directly at him. "Don't wake it," she whispered. Eli swallowed hard. "Wake what?" She didn't answer, just pointed at the mirror, where her reflection remained still even though she had moved. He turned slowly to look, and in that mirror, it wasn't the little girl reflected. It was Eli, but older, worn, eyes darkened by things yet to come, and he was smiling, a smile too wide, too knowing. The little girl's voice trembled now. If you talk to it, it follows. If you listen, it remembers. Then the door slammed behind him again, and when he turned back, the girl was gone. The bed was made, the room was empty, and the mirror now showed the hallway again. But this time Eli was standing at the far end, looking back at himself. Still, always still. The reflection of himself, standing at the far end of the corridor in the mirror, didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. It simply stared, as though waiting for Eli to understand something he hadn't yet remembered. And when he blinked, the image was gone, and the mirror reflected only darkness behind him, even though the room's overhead light still flickered faintly above. A breath escaped his lips, shallow and shaky, and he turned to leave the room. But the door he had entered through no longer existed, the wall seamless and blank where it should have stood, like the architecture of this place changed with every decision, responding not to logic, but to memory, fear, and something deeper that pulsed beneath the wallpaper, like veins beneath skin. He stepped back into the hallway, which no longer resembled a hallway but something much older. The carpet faded into warped wooden planks beneath his feet, creaking softly with each hesitant step, the wallpaper growing darker in hue and heavier in scent, like mold mixed with ash, as though this place had burned once, long ago, and never quite forgot it. A door to his left stood open, just a crack, and from inside came the faintest sound of ticking, like dozens of clocks out of sync, each one echoing a different second. A dissonant orchestra of forgotten time. He shouldn't have looked, but curiosity is a quiet scream, and so he pushed the door open gently with one trembling finger and stepped inside. The room was small and square, lit only by a single bare bulb that swung slowly from the ceiling despite the still air. And on every surface, shelves, floor, even the bed, sat clocks, hundreds of them, none matching, all ticking their own way forward, some too fast, some too slow, some backwards. And in the center of the room sat a chair, and in that chair, a man, or what had once been a man, now a husk with skin like crumpled paper, and eyes wide open, unblinking, as if frozen in the middle of a thought he'd never finished. In his lap sat a pocket watch, ticking backward. Eli stared at the man, whose lips began to move, not naturally but like puppetry, stiff and slow, and in a voice that sounded like wind through a grave, he whispered, "I waited too long." Then the ticking stopped. All of it. Every clock in the room fell silent in an instant, leaving behind a ringing emptiness, so sharp it felt physical. And from behind Eli, the whisper returned. Not a word, not a sentence, just the sound of breath brushing against memory. He turned, but nothing was there. And yet, he wasn't alone. The room exhaled, or something in it did, and the bulb above him flared once, then died, plunging the clocks into darkness. He backed out slowly, heart thudding so loud he could hear it in his ears. And when he emerged into the hallway again, the door behind him was gone, just as before, leaving only another stretch of corridor that seemed to grow longer with each breath he took. It wasn't just the place that was changing. He was changing. His hands trembled more than before. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on his shoulders like unseen fingers, and the silence between sounds grew longer, as though the building itself was listening more intently. At the far end of the corridor stood a set of stairs leading downward, not the elegant ones from the lobby, but narrow wooden ones that creaked just from being looked at, and a faint rhythmic tapping echoed from below, like someone walking slowly in a circle on tiles that had forgotten what warmth was. He descended, each step groaning beneath his weight, and the moment his foot touched the cold stone of the lower floor, he felt it, that presence again, like someone just behind him, watching with breath held and thoughts sharpened. This level was different, older. The walls weren't wallpapered, but brick, slick with moisture, and the floor sloped gently downward, leading towards something unseen but undeniable. Like gravity itself pulled his soul toward it. He passed doors marked only with symbols, none he recognized, each one slightly ajar, each releasing faint sounds into the corridor. A woman humming a lullaby in reverse, the scratching of fingernails on wood, the soft patter of feet that weren't walking, but pacing, trapped in patterns older than memory. And then he saw it. Room 9, at the very end, perfectly sealed. No light beneath the door, no handle on this side, just a small brass plaque, tarnished with time, that read, "Occupied." As he stood there, frozen, the silence thickened around him, as if the building itself leaned in to listen to his breath. And from the door, not around it, not under it, but from inside the very wood, came a sound, not loud, not aggressive, just knocking. 3 soft, slow knocks, and then a voice, not spoken aloud, but within him, deep and clear. "You were never supposed to leave." His knees buckled slightly, but he caught himself, hands scraping against the stone wall. And when he looked again, the door was open. Only slightly, a line of darkness within darkness. And from that space came a warmth he didn't expect. Not comforting, but familiar. Like a room remembered from a dream that always ended too early. His feet moved on their own, drawn not by fear but by a question he could no longer leave unanswered. And as he stepped into room 9, the door closed behind him with a click that echoed like thunder through his chest. The hallway seemed darker than it had before, though the single bulb overhead still flickered in the same rhythmic pattern. But now it felt as if the shadows had learned to breathe, exhaling cold whiffs into the still air with every flicker of light. And as Daniel stepped out of room 9, he noticed the carpet felt damp beneath his socks, as if it had absorbed something that didn't belong in this world, something older than water. And when he looked down, he found that the hallway was lined with faint, wet footprints, not his, and not shaped like anything human, wide and too long, like a creature dragging itself forward slowly with intent. leading toward the old service elevator at the far end of the corridor. The one Mrs. Bellman had said hadn't worked in decades, but the panel beside it was glowing faintly red now, blinking steadily, calling, pulsing, and when Daniel reached out to touch the button, the air around him seemed to hum like an ancient throat whispering in reverse, a chant without language, a promise wrapped in silence. And as his finger pressed the button, the elevator shuddered awake with a groan that echoed through the walls like a sigh from the bowels of the building. The doors creaked open slowly, revealing not the inside of an elevator, but a narrow stairwell descending into darkness, lined with cracked tiles and rusted pipes, and a strange low hum seemed to vibrate from below, like the building itself was alive and dreaming, and Daniel felt something behind him, a soft touch, the brushing of cold fingers against his neck. But when he turned, the hallway was empty again, though room 9's door was now wide open, and inside the shadows moved as if watching him, waiting, not threatening, just aware, just patient, and without knowing why. He stepped into the elevator shaft, feeling the pull of something vast and forgotten drawing him down, one foot after another on the crumbling staircase, until the doors slid shut behind him with a hiss like a final breath, sealing him in the silence that now pressed against his ears like thick fog. And as he descended, each step deeper seemed to stretch time, making minutes feel like hours, the hum growing louder now, almost melodic, almost like a lullaby played backwards. And on the 15th step, he saw it, a door. A black door, just floating there, suspended in the dark, not attached to anything, not part of any wall, and written across it in wet, glistening strokes were the words, "Where the silence sleeps, it dreams of you." Daniel stood before the floating black door, his breath shallow, his heartbeat impossibly loud in the silence that felt less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something ancient listening too closely. And as he reached for the handle, an iron ring, cold and slick like it had been pulled from the bottom of a lake, he hesitated, not out of fear, but because the door seemed to be breathing too, inhaling slowly, exhaling in quiet pulses that made the air taste of rust and forgotten things. And when his fingers finally closed around the ring and pulled, the door didn't swing open but instead dissolved, like smoke sucked into a void, revealing not a room, but a memory, one he didn't recognize as his own. Yet it bled into him anyway, thick and slow, and suddenly he was standing in a dim hospital room, the air smelling of iodine and distant thunder, with a single bed in the center, occupied by a child staring up at the ceiling with hollow eyes, her face pale and her lips cracked from whispering things no one had ever written down. And Daniel felt drawn to her, though he didn't know her name, or why her presence felt like a weight pressing against the corners of his mind. But as he approached, the child turned her head slowly and smiled with a sadness so deep it trembled the walls, and she whispered, "They took my name so I wouldn't remember the silence," before fading into dust that swirled into a shape, room 9's door, right there in the middle of the hospital floor. And as Daniel stepped through it, he was back in the stairwell again, heart racing, the black door gone behind him. But something had changed because now he could hear it, the silence, not just feel it. A tone so low it lived in his bones, like a hidden frequency only this place could transmit. And his name echoed inside it, not spoken aloud but carved into it, as though this silence had always been meant for him, a homecoming he never asked for. And as he descended further, he noticed the walls were now pulsing slightly, slow and wet, like lungs or wombs. And the deeper he went, the more the staircase began to narrow, the light fading into a purple dusk glow that came from no source. And soon he could see another figure far below, unmoving, standing in the middle of the steps, a woman in a nurse's uniform, soaked in something dark, head tilted sideways, her eyes wide open and unblinking, as if waiting for someone to finally notice her. And when Daniel called out, her mouth opened, but no sound came, only a long ribbon of black thread that spilled from her lips and down the stairs, coiling like a serpent toward his feet. And as it touched him, his vision blurred. The staircase flickered, and he was suddenly standing in a hallway he'd never seen before, narrow and too long, lined with dozens of doors, all marked Room 9, and every one of them began to open slowly in unison, with creaks that sounded like crying, revealing nothing inside but darkness. And the silence whispered from within each of them in voices that were almost his own, saying things he had never said but somehow remembered. And as he turned to run, the hallway stretched with him, the end always just out of reach. And the nurse's voice finally spoke behind him. "Don't you remember what you left behind here?" Daniel froze at the sound of the nurse's voice behind him, soft and hollow like a dream whispered through water. And though every instinct told him to run, something deeper, something that felt older than fear, held him in place, as if her question had unlocked a part of his memory he hadn't known was sealed. And when he turned around, she was no longer at the far end of the corridor, but standing just inches away from him, her eyes wide and glossy like porcelain dolls, her mouth still sewn shut by that long, coiling black thread. And yet her voice echoed clearly inside his skull, vibrating against the inner walls of his mind like a forgotten melody, begging to be remembered. And she said again, "Don't you remember what you left behind here?" But this time her tone carried something new. Grief, maybe, or a quiet kind of rage, the sort that grows in silence like mold under wallpaper. And as she raised one pale, shaking hand to point down the endless corridor of Room 9 doors, Daniel felt the walls shift again, the air thickening, the light dimming until it all felt like twilight in a place that had never known a sun. And slowly, without knowing why, he began walking forward, past one door, then another, each one slightly ajar, each one creaking wider as he passed like old mouths trying to breathe him in. And from each room, he heard fragments, voices, whispers, some pleading, some weeping, some just mumbling names over and over again. But none of the voices were whole, like listening to the radio through broken glass. And he realized with a sudden chill crawling up his spine that many of the voices were his own, different tones, different ages, echoes of versions of himself he had long since buried or forgotten. And the hallway stretched on, looping in on itself until he could no longer tell how far he'd come or how long he'd been walking. But time had become meaningless in this place, where the clocks melted like candle wax and footsteps sounded like echoes from another life. And then, without warning, one of the doors to his left slammed shut, hard enough to shake the floor. And the moment it did, the lights above flickered violently, plunging everything into darkness, except for a faint glow leaking from the crack beneath that door. A sickly green light that pulsed like a heartbeat. And something inside him, a curiosity laced with dread, compelled him to reach for the handle. And the moment his skin touched the brass, an overwhelming wave of nausea and vertigo washed over him as if the floor had dropped away, and he was falling, not through space but through moments, memories, fragments of things that didn't belong to him, yet felt familiar. And when the door opened, he wasn't in a hallway anymore, but in a room that looked exactly like his childhood bedroom, except wrong. Wrong in the way dreams feel like home until you notice the windows have no glass and the shadows don't follow the rules of light. And the wallpaper was peeling in long, wet strips, and the stuffed bear on the shelf turned its head slowly to look at him with black button eyes that blinked once, deliberately, as if to say, "Yes, you've been here before." And Daniel staggered into the room, the floor groaning under his feet like something alive just beneath the wood. And there, in the corner where his old desk used to be, sat a boy no older than 7, legs crossed, head bowed, humming softly to himself, rocking gently back and forth. And Daniel felt his throat tighten because the boy was him, not just a resemblance, but exactly him, down to the small scar above his right eyebrow from where he fell off the bike at age 6. And the boy lifted his head slowly, meeting his gaze with eyes that weren't his own. They were hollow, glassy, and reflected not light, but rooms, dozens of rooms, all labeled Room 9, stretching infinitely in those empty sockets like a map of everything lost in silence. And the boy spoke, voice fragile and toneless. "You left me here when you forgot how to scream." And Daniel tried to speak, to explain, to deny, but no sound came out of his mouth, only mist. And the boy reached out, pressing a cold little hand against his. And suddenly Daniel remembered. He remembered the night the silence first came. He had been 7. His mother was screaming in the kitchen. His father wasn't moving. There had been a noise, like a wine glass cracking, like a whisper with teeth. And something had come through the back door. Not a man, not an animal, just a shape that moved like smoke and smelled like static and old leaves. And Daniel had run upstairs, locked his door, and waited for the screaming to stop. And when it did, it never started again. And he had waited for morning. But morning never came, not in that house, not after that night. And something had changed in him. Something had sealed shut, and in its place had grown silence, thick and patient, like ivy over a forgotten grave. And now he remembered where it had taken root. Room 9. He had stayed at a motel with his aunt the next day. She said it was temporary, just for a night. Room 9, he had stared at the walls and said nothing. The silence had followed him there, and it had found him, and it had never left. And as the memory surged through him like electricity in cold blood, the boy in front of him began to fade, smiling gently, and he whispered, "Now you remember, it can begin again." And Daniel was alone in the room, though now the floor was gone beneath him, and he was standing on black water, still and glassy, stretching in all directions. And above him, the ceiling pulsed like a heartbeat, and around him, doors floated in the air, slowly spinning, hundreds of them, each marked with a number, and only one of them glowed faintly. Room 9 waiting, and a voice, his voice, but older, cracked, spoke softly behind him. "Once you open it, you don't leave. You only go deeper." And Daniel turned to face the voice, but saw only his reflection in the water, staring up at him from beneath the surface, smiling with teeth that didn't look like his. And then the reflection blinked. Daniel stared into the water, watching the reflection smile up at him with that slow, unnatural stretch of lips that felt too wide, too still, and behind the eyes, his eyes, there was something flickering, like a dying star caught in black ink. something not entirely alive but not dead either. And as he crouched to get a closer look, the surface rippled without touch, distorting the reflection until it was no longer him staring back, but something wearing his face like a mask, the same expression, the same bone structure. But the eyes were glassy black pools and the skin around the mouth twitched slightly, like it had forgotten how to be human. And without warning, the hand of the reflection shot upward through the water, impossibly fast, grabbing Daniel by the wrist and pulling him down with a strength that felt infinite, ancient, cold as the grave. And for a moment there was only water, thick and syrupy, forcing itself into his lungs as he plunged deeper, deeper still, into darkness that didn't feel like absence but presence. Something living all around him, brushing against his skin like strands of hair or fingers or thoughts that weren't his, whispering things in a language not meant for air. And just when his lungs screamed for breath, he broke through the surface, but not into air, into fog, a low, endless fog rolling over an empty field under a sky the color of bruises, with the sound of creaking wood echoing faintly in the distance, rhythmic and patient like a rocking chair on a porch that didn't exist anymore. And Daniel stood soaked to the bone in the middle of that field, his heart pounding, his skin cold, his mind struggling to hold itself together as the fog twisted itself into fleeting shapes that dissolved before his eyes. Faces, hands, doors, all of them gone before they fully formed, as if the air itself was remembering things too quickly to hold on, and the only thing solid was a narrow path of gravel beneath his feet, stretching into the mist like a suggestion more than a road. And with nowhere else to go, he walked, each step crunching faintly as the sky shifted color, slowly turning a deeper shade of violet like the last hour before night forgets the sun. And as he walked, the sound of creaking grew louder, more distinct, and soon the fog parted just enough to reveal a house. No, not just a house. The house. The one he had seen in flashes, through dreams and childhood drawings, and nightmares so old they'd grown quiet in the back of his skull. A tall, narrow structure with slanted shutters, windows that blinked instead of opening, and walls made of dark wood that pulsed like it remembered being part of something alive. And on the porch sat the rocking chair, moving steadily with no one in it, back and forth, creaking like a clock that had forgotten how to count time. And the door was already open, just a crack, just enough to show the sliver of darkness inside. The kind of darkness that isn't empty, but full of waiting. And as Daniel stepped onto the porch, the boards beneath him moaned softly, protesting his presence, or perhaps warning him. And when he pushed the door open, it didn't swing. It sighed like an old man exhaling a truth he'd carried for far too long. And inside the house was too big, impossibly big, with ceilings that vanished into shadow and walls that stretched too far away. And every surface was covered in framed photographs, but not of people, of rooms. Every photograph was a room. Every room was room 9. Different furniture, different lighting, different decades, but always room 9. Always the same dimensions, the same number on the door, and under each photograph, a small metal plate engraved with names. Some of them scratched out, others faded. And as Daniel stepped deeper into the house, he realized the photographs were humming, a low vibration that tickled his teeth and made the air shimmer. And then he noticed the shadows weren't behaving. They slid too slowly, didn't align with the light, moved even when nothing else did. And just ahead, at the base of a staircase that spiraled upward, Like a spine twisting through the center of the house, stood the nurse again, her uniform stained darker now, her mouth still sealed with thread, but her eyes wide with something that looked like grief and warning and something older than both. And this time she didn't speak. She held out a key, black, long, old, the metal cold even from a distance. And Daniel took it without words, without question, because some part of him knew what it unlocked, had always known. And as soon as it touched his skin, the house shifted, walls pulling tighter, doors slamming shut in a wave of muffled thuds. The photos flickering like film caught in a dying projector. And from upstairs came the sound of something heavy dragging itself across the floor, slow and wet and deliberate. And Daniel knew with a quiet certainty that he had to go up, had to follow, because the thing he left behind wasn't waiting in a room anymore. It was awake, it had climbed out, and it was remembering him. He took the stairs slowly, each step creaking louder than it should have, echoing unnaturally, and the shadows along the walls bent inward as if watching, as if listening, and at the top of the stairs was a single hallway, long and narrow, wallpaper peeling in long curls, and at the far end a single door, black, old, cracked, and marked not with a number, but with a name, his name, carved deep into the wood, like something that wanted to make sure it couldn't be erased. And the key in his hand grew warmer the closer he got, pulsing with every step. And behind the door, he could hear breathing, not his, something deep, steady, mechanical almost, but too wet to be a machine. And when he reached the door, his hand shook as he lifted the key, and he whispered to himself, barely audible, "What if I don't open it?" And the house whispered back, not in words, but in pressure, in air that thickened around his chest and hissed in his ears. And he understood. This wasn't a door to something. This was a door back and forward at the same time, a loop, a choice, and he had already turned the key, and he was already inside. The door closed behind Daniel without a sound, without a latch or click or final moment of decision, only the soft hush of air shifting like a sigh, too tired to escape. And inside the room there was no light and no space, only a vast and strange stillness, a silence so thick it felt like a second skin, clinging to him, pressing into his ears, his eyes, the back of his throat. And for a long time he just stood there, breathing shallowly, trying to adjust to a darkness that didn't want to be seen through, a darkness that wasn't empty, but listening. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the room began to show itself in pieces, as if revealing anything more would break some long-held rule. And the first thing he saw was the bed. Not a bed, his bed, the one from room 9, the one from years ago, the one he had sat on when he was 7 and the world outside the window had gone completely still after the screaming stopped. And beside the bed was a small table, and on it sat the radio, the exact same one with the little cracked dial, the same music box jingle humming faintly beneath the static, like an echo from a childhood too strange to belong to him anymore. And there were items here too, a pair of muddy shoes, a broken mirror, an old coat with torn lining, a crumpled drawing of a house in red crayon. Things he remembered and things he didn't. Objects plucked from memory and dream and buried emotion, laid out like exhibits in a museum built just for him, and all of it was lit by one dim, flickering lamp in the corner, casting long, slow-moving shadows that didn't seem entirely tethered to what caused them. And as he took a step deeper into the room, the floor groaned underfoot with a sound that felt like recognition, not just wood-bending, but welcoming or perhaps claiming, and the moment he reached the center of the room, the walls began to breathe. Not move, breathe, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that synced perfectly with his own heartbeat, and a low humming vibration began to rise from the floorboards, through his legs, into his spine, into his teeth, and the radio clicked once, then again, and the static grew louder until a voice emerged from within it. His voice, but not from now, from then, a child's whisper, frightened and small and trembling, repeating the same phrase over and over, like a forgotten chant. I didn't mean to lock the door. I didn't mean to lock the door. I didn't mean to. And Daniel's hands began to shake as the weight of something hidden began crawling back into the light. A memory not just buried but sealed. Something he had made sure to forget because remembering it would mean facing something he could never undo. And suddenly the walls of the room shimmered like heat waves, and the entire space shifted, warped, and rearranged itself like a dream collapsing into another dream. And he was no longer standing in room 9, not as he knew it. He was inside the house from his childhood, specifically the kitchen, and it was exactly as it had been that night. The table overturned, the plates shattered on the floor, a trail of something dark leading toward the back door, and the smell, the terrible coppery smell that no child should ever associate with home, hit him like a wave, and he saw his mother slumped in the corner, her eyes wide but not seeing, her mouth open in a silent scream. And across the room, the back door was open, but beyond it there was no outside, only the hallway of the motel, stretching endlessly in both directions. Room 9 at every turn, and the shadow standing in the doorway was neither man nor creature, but something in between, tall and thin and wrong, with a head that tilted too far to the left, and arms that twitched like clock hands, resetting themselves. And young Daniel was there, frozen, staring, hiding behind the kitchen island. And he, the now Daniel, could see both versions of himself at once, the one who hid and the one who watched. And the thing in the doorway stepped inside, dragging something invisible behind it that scraped against the floor like a nail through glass. And when it turned toward young Daniel, the shadows peeled back from its face to reveal nothing, only the shifting outline of a void that pulsed like a heartbeat. And adult Daniel tried to shout, tried to scream, tried to stop it from happening again. But the moment he opened his mouth, the silence poured in. A choking, heavy, ancient silence that filled his lungs like tar and coated his thoughts like frost. And he realized it wasn't just memory he was walking through. It was repetition. It was trap. It was design. This moment had replayed for years, over and over, in dreams, in silence, in everything he had chosen not to feel. And now he had stepped back into it, and the door he had locked all those years ago, the one that had saved him from the thing, had also sealed away a scream that had never left his body. And that scream had grown, had taken shape, had become Room 9. And now it wanted to finish what had been started. The creature, if it could be called that, knelt beside young Daniel, whose eyes were glassy and unblinking, and reached out a hand made of fog and absence and whispers. And adult Daniel screamed, finally screamed, and the world broke open. Not shattered, peeled, like wallpaper, like skin. And he was falling again, only now not down but inward, into himself, through every locked memory, every echo chamber of guilt and fear, every moment where he had chosen silence over sound, numbness over grief, and the deeper he fell, the more Room 9 unfolded around him. Infinite, recursive, each room a layer of himself, a version of the night that had shaped him, each one slightly different, slightly more broken, and then he stopped, standing in front of a mirror. An ordinary mirror, except that the version of him inside it wasn't mirroring his movements. This version looked older, worn, quiet. And the mirrored Daniel spoke first, his voice dry and soft, like paper burning slowly. "You've carried the silence long enough. It's time to let it speak." And then the mirror cracked, not shattered, just a single long fracture from top to bottom. And behind it, Daniel saw something else. Not a room, not a memory, a door. Again, always the door, always Room 9. And from the other side of the glass, something began knocking. The knock came once, soft but hollow, like knuckles on wood submerged in water. Then again, louder this time, deeper, like it wasn't just a hand tapping from the other side, but a memory pushing through skin. And Daniel stood before the cracked mirror, the line down the glass slowly widening like a wound being pulled open, revealing more of the door behind it. A door identical to Room 9's, dark wood and tarnished brass, worn at the edges, but this one shimmered faintly as though it wasn't entirely solid, as if it existed somewhere between real and remembered. And the version of Daniel inside the mirror, older, paler, stood perfectly still now, watching with unreadable eyes. And as the knock came a third time, sharp and sudden like a heartbeat skipping, the mirrored Daniel finally lifted a hand and placed it on the glass, palm flat against the fracture. And without knowing why, Daniel raised his own hand and did the same. And the moment their fingers aligned, the mirror rippled outward in circles of cold silver light, and the entire world tilted as if the floor had become a wave shifting beneath him. And then the glass vanished, and Daniel was inside the mirror, not looking into it, inside it. Or maybe he always had been. The hallway behind him was gone. The room with the bed, the radio, the kitchen, gone. There was only the hallway again, only it wasn't the motel now. It was older, narrower, a corridor from some forgotten asylum or school, lined with door after door, each marked not with numbers, but with names. Names etched directly into the wood like carvings at a graveyard. And every door hummed faintly with sound, with whispers, with static, with voices too low to hear clearly. And as Daniel walked forward, his name repeated itself again and again. Daniel Rhodes, Daniel Rhodes, Daniel Rhodes. Every door, every step. And some part of him knew these were all versions of himself, split like veins from one heart, each door holding a piece of a self left behind after trauma, after fear, after silence had taken root and grown deep. And finally the hallway ended, and there was one final door, the larger, darker, older than the rest, and it had no name, only a mirror. The entire front of the door was a tall, seamless mirror, reflecting him in perfect stillness, and for a long time he did nothing but stand there, watching himself, trying to find something different in the glass, something subtle, a twitch, a blink, a change in posture. But there was nothing, only the soft flickering of light from nowhere, and the sound of breathing that wasn't his. And he reached out slowly, touched the mirror, expecting the same ripple. But this time it stayed cold, solid, still, and then the breathing stopped, and his reflection blinked. But he hadn't. And then it smiled, slow, wide, the same too large, too calm smile he'd seen in the pond. And it leaned forward slightly as if to whisper, and the words didn't come from the glass, but from inside his own head. You locked me in so you wouldn't have to remember, but I've been remembering everything. And then the glass began to crack, not from the outside, but from within. Spiderweb lines spreading across the surface like ice under pressure, and his reflection pressed its hands against the inside of the glass, eyes wide and wild, mouthing something now. Let me out! Again and again, louder each time, though the sound never touched the air, and the cracks grew, and Daniel staggered back. But the hallway was gone, the walls were gone, the floor vanished beneath his feet, and he was falling once more, but this time not through memory, through himself, falling through every version of his life where silence had settled like rot in the walls, where room 9 hadn't just haunted him, but followed him, changed shape, changed name, becoming places he avoided, conversations he couldn't have, people he pushed away, and all of them spiraled around him now, a hurricane of echoes and broken time. And just as he began to scream, the world snapped to a halt, and he was standing in room 9 again, the real one, the motel room, exactly as it was the first time. Neatly made bed, TV unplugged, radio silent, curtains drawn, door slightly ajar. But now there was a chair in the center of the room, and in the chair sat himself, or a version of him. Not the child, not the reflection, not the echo, but something older, something tired, something waiting. And when it looked up, it had his eyes, but darker, like they'd seen too much too slowly. And the version in the chair spoke calmly, gently, the way someone might speak to an animal caught in a trap. You've come far to hear what you already knew. And Daniel stepped forward slowly, the air thick and quiet again. But this time the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt curious, like the room itself was leaning in to listen. And the version in the chair continued. Room 9 was never just a place. It was the moment you decided forgetting was safer than remembering. But forgetting doesn't bury it. It grows. It waits. Daniel asked, "What am I supposed to do?" And the version in the chair smiled softly, sadly, and said, "Open the door," and gestured to the closet. Daniel turned. He hadn't noticed it before. A narrow wooden closet door, plain and quiet, but now it pulsed slightly, like a heartbeat behind the wood. And there were scratches near the handle, long and desperate. And from the other side he could hear something breathing again. Only this time it was ragged, unsteady, almost afraid. And as he reached for the handle, his hand hovered just above the brass knob, cold and old and trembling, and he whispered without meaning to, "Will it end if I do?" And from behind him, the version in the chair whispered back, "No, but it will begin." And Daniel turned the handle, and the door opened. And something looked back at him with eyes that matched his own, wet with memory and full of silence, and ready to speak. The figure inside the closet did not rush forward, did not scream, did not reach for him. It simply stood there, half-shadowed, half-formed, as if it had been built from everything Daniel had refused to feel, its outline flickering like old film caught in the reel, and its face, his face, held all the weight of the years he had lost to numbness, to pretending, to silence. And they stared at each other across that small, impossible threshold as the air grew colder, thicker, until Daniel could see his own breath curling into the space between them, like smoke from a long-dead fire. And then the version of him inside the closet whispered, "You locked the door, but I was still there, screaming." And suddenly Daniel remembered, not just the night, not just the fear, But the moment he had chosen to walk away from the door, to leave something behind, something crying out for help from the dark, something that might have been a part of him, or someone else entirely, and the truth crashed through him like a wave of glass. He hadn't just survived room 9. He had traded something for that survival. A sound, a memory, a boy, a brother. A shadow too fragile to remember fully, a face that blurred whenever he tried to picture it. And now, in the space between the closet walls, that shadow took shape, and it spoke in a voice Daniel recognized in his marrow. "You said you'd come back, but you never did." And Daniel collapsed to his knees, not from pain, but from the unbearable weight of a silence finally shattered, his own voice breaking free after years of being buried beneath layers of pretending and forgetting. "I was scared. I didn't know how. I didn't want to believe you were real." And the figure stepped out of the closet, slow, steady, like it had all the time in the world. And now it looked more like a child than a ghost, barefoot and pale, with tear-streaked cheeks and a cut across his brow that hadn't healed. And Daniel whispered again, this time to himself, "Your name was Eli." And the child nodded. "You forgot me," he said, but not with anger, only with the quiet sorrow of someone who waited too long in the dark. And Daniel reached out with shaking hands, and the boy didn't flinch. He stepped forward and fell into him, arms around Daniel's chest. And for a moment, there was nothing but that. The warmth of contact, the weight of what was lost finally returning, and behind them the closet began to close on its own, not shutting in anger, but in peace, like a chapter being closed in a book that no longer needed to be read aloud. And the silence in the room shifted, not gone, but no longer empty. Now it was full, full of breath, full of memory, full of truth. And then the room began to change. The wallpaper peeled away in slow curls, revealing clean white walls beneath it. The musty carpet dissolved into polished floorboards. The air warmed, the smell of rot replaced by something familiar. Lemon oil, childhood, safety. And Daniel stood up, holding Eli's hand now, as the door to room 9 creaked open. And daylight spilled in for the first time in years. The hallway outside was no longer endless, no longer twisted with shadows or repetition. It was simply a corridor with numbers on the doors and light from the windows at the far end. And Daniel stepped out of room 9 with Eli beside him, and behind them the door gently clicked shut. Not locked, not sealed, just closed. And they walked slowly, passing other rooms, hearing nothing but the soft rhythm of footsteps and breath. And with each step, Daniel felt lighter, as if the silence he had carried for so long was finally settling into a place that no longer needed to be feared, just remembered. They came to the end of the hall, and there, waiting by the exit sign, was the old woman from the front desk, her eyes no longer empty, but full of something deep and proud and unspoken, and she nodded once. "You opened the right door," she said, and Eli looked up at Daniel and smiled, and Daniel smiled back through tears he hadn't allowed in years. And they pushed through the door, into light, into morning, into something that felt a little like forgiveness. And behind them, room 9 stood quiet, empty, listening, waiting, but no longer hungry, no longer haunted. Just a room, just a silence. And sometimes silence is not what hides the truth, but what remains after the truth has been set free.